Good afternoon and welcome to the Redbird Educator Series. I'm Deborah McPhee, Director of the Borg Center for Reading and Literacy, and Molly Davis, Director of Constituent Relations in the College of Education, is controlling things behind the scenes for us today. Thank you for being here. We are excited to have Dr. Kate Peoples with us today to share her presentation, What's the Word? Using explicit vocabulary instruction to support all learners. We encourage you to use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to post comments and questions and to engage with each other around the ideas and strategies shared during the presentation. I will monitor the chat and rejoin the webinar after the presentation to moderate a Q&A with Dr. Peoples. Now let's get started. Dr. Peoples is an assistant professor in the Special Education Department of the College of Education at Illinois State University. She teaches courses in language and literacy development and literacy teaching methods for future special education teachers. Before joining the ISU faculty in 2019, Dr. Peoples completed her dissertation in special education with honors at the University of Virginia. Prior to beginning her doctoral studies, Dr. Peoples served as a general and special education teacher for 11 years in both Virginia and in her home state of North Carolina. Her doctoral dissertation, titled Math is Not a Universal Language, studied the impact of training middle school mathematics teachers in explicit vocabulary instructional practices to support learners with disabilities and other difficulties in mathematics. Dr. Peoples has continued to conduct research in the area of explicit vocabulary instruction built on the science of reading, with an emphasis on working with secondary mathematics and science teachers who teach inclusive general education classes. Dr. Peoples, take it away.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and be doing this today. This is going to be fun, you guys, I promise. I'm really excited about this. I'm so excited that there's this many people that want to talk about vocabulary, for one thing. That's always fun. So I know a little bit about who you are and where you're from, but I want to start with just sort of seeing how things are going for you today. So if you would use the chat, not the Q&A, the chat, and take a look here at this image and decide which of these giant inflatable ducks describes how things are going for you today. How are you doing? I know it's Thursday. It's been a long week for me. I don't know about you guys, but it's been rough. Ooh, a 1 and an exclamation point. Yeah, love it. And a 7 and an exclamation point. I see you, Andrew. I see you. Awesome. I'm so excited. All right. Great. This is so cool. Thank you so much for responding. I love that there's so many 1, 2s, and 3s today. And then if you're a 4, 5, or 6, I hear you. That's kind of where I'm at. I'm about a 4.5. I'll be honest. And for my 7, 8s, and 9s, I'm hoping for you. I hope this is a quick hour for you. I hope that you're feeling better soon. Hopefully we can lift your spirits a little bit in this webinar. So thank you so much for participating with that. And we'll check in again with stuff like that in a minute. I wanted to start by just kind of introducing myself and my experience. Deb mentioned that I was a gen ed and special ed teacher for 11 years in my home state of North Carolina and then in Virginia, which is right next door. So I know that you all as classroom teachers or even as faculty members, community college classrooms, we're inclusive of that too when we talk about teachers. Your world is rather small and rather large at the same time. And your life is never really just in your classroom. It feels that way sometimes. But you work with a lot of other people and you work with all of your students and then some students who aren't always your students. But you work within a network of people, for better or worse. And so I wanted to share with you and start letting you get to know me a little bit by giving you a little window into some of my favorite teaching experiences. And I'm not going to tell you all these stories behind all these photos, but I will say that I have permission to use them. And in a lot of ways, I miss the K-12 day to day. I don't know if I miss it during COVID, I'll be honest. But working with teachers who are already in the schools is something that I'm really passionate about doing, and I'm looking forward to being able to do that some more. Hopefully, as we all move on from this extended 2020, what seems like an extended 2020. So I'm looking forward to doing that. I also am really passionate about working with my pre-service teachers here at ISU. And I work really hard, and they work really hard to become ready to deal with reading issues in the classrooms that they work with, and to support the teachers that they're going to work with when they have kids who are struggling with reading and reading relating issues. So this is something that's very, very near and dear to my heart, but also very close to my actual experience as a teacher. So with that being said, let's jump right in, shall we? So I know I'm hitting you with kind of a big term right off the bat, but stick with me. We're going to get to the vocabulary stuff, I promise. I'm building up to it. So let's start by talking about cognitive load. Cognitive load is the idea that you're able to learn, remember, and apply new information only as much as the complexity of that information and the presentation of that information kind of allow you to. So this has been sort of a well-known theory in education research for a couple of decades now. And it's the idea that not just what we present to students matters in terms of that complexity, but also how we present it. And so where I'm really going to try to focus a little bit is sort of on the how, but also on what we can do about the what we're presenting, and still make sure that we're providing, you know, a good, solid, rigorous education. Rigor was a word that the last school district I worked in really loved that word. They use it a lot. So that's our working definition of cognitive load theory, which is actually made up of these three types of load, really sort of phenomenon that are happening in your brain whenever you're trying to learn a new thing. The first one is intrinsic load. I'll define that for you in a bit. And then we have extraneous load. And then we have what's left over, which is germane load. And we'll talk about each of these separately. So intrinsic cognitive load has to do with, like I said, the content itself. So regardless of how you present it, when the content or the information is a very complex one, there's a lot of sort of conceptual understandings that are needed to really understand what's going on in the new information. For this, I have an image of what's called legalese sometimes. So like lawyer speak. I have a lot of lawyers in my family. So this is a thing I'm familiar with. I can't make my way through an amicus brief to save my life, which is probably good because I don't need to. So that's good. But intrinsic cognitive load is up, right? Is really high when the content itself is super complex, kind of like what's going on in this image. So when the content itself is just, there's so many words and there's long sentences, and for if anybody's ever tried to read a research article, especially in our field, sometimes it's just the grammar, it just doesn't work in a easy facilitated way. So sometimes the complexity is what drives up that cognitive load a little bit. What drives up your extraneous cognitive load, that does have to do with how we are delivering or teaching the information that we're trying to get across. So this is an example of a slide that I think we've all experienced in some way, shape, or form. Either we made it or we were subjected to it. This is not, a great way to process information. This is resulting, the way that this particular image on this slide, the way that this information is presented is demanding of my extraneous cognitive load, right? So I'm having to use a lot of my cognitive resources to understand and navigate the information the way it's presented, when it could be presented in a slightly simpler way, perhaps. So what we do as teachers a lot of time is, whether we realize it or not, we think about delivery and how the way that I'm teaching enables or hinders students to be able to understand what I'm trying to get them to understand. So with these two things combined, intrinsic and extraneous cognitive load, when those things are kind of at a high, that's going to be hard for any student, right? For students who are already experiencing some difficulties with the content that we're teaching, and notice I'm not just speaking to students with disabilities, that although we would definitely include them here. But students who are just having trouble with the material for whatever reason. That cognitive load can be lightened a little bit if the learner has some background knowledge, has some prior knowledge about that topic. As classroom teachers, you guys have probably already figured that out. So nothing new there. But that's sort of the path we're going down with some of these strategies we're going to get to in a minute. But the other thing we have to think about is that some modes of instruction come with a much higher demand on extraneous cognitive load than others. For example, inquiry-based learning, science labs, project-based learning, those kinds of hands-on application type of activities and type of lessons demand that you can navigate the problem itself in order to learn what you need to learn. That demands a much higher extraneous load than something that's more direct and straightforward. So we're going to talk about striking a balance between those two and using vocabulary instruction to really build that content knowledge to help with some of this. And the other thing I want to point out is that sometimes it seems like we're lightening that cognitive load and we're really not. So I'll show you a couple of examples of that too. Sometimes we're presenting information in a way that we think is straightforward and there's not too much conflicting information and there's not too much to have to take in. But sometimes what makes sense to me, because I know this material really well, may not be what's coming across to you the way that I think it is, which is sort of the great irony of this presentation. But for example, sorry, not for example, but cognitive load then, total cognitive load is made up of that intrinsic load and that extraneous load. So then what's left over is your germane load. And that is also sometimes we interchangeably use working memory as a term for that. Cognitive psychologists would probably come after me for saying that those are interchangeable, but for our purposes, working memory, right? Haven't stored it in long-term memory yet, but it's here, right? It's in my working memory bank. So that's what is left to actually deal with learning that new content. So before we can even start trying to learn new information or new content, we've got to manage the intrinsic load and the extraneous load of that content. And if you're a student sitting in a 6th grade math class, that's not really in your control. So you're kind of stuck with what you're stuck with in a way. So the reason I wanted to talk a little bit about cognitive load was for it to kind of start to inform, if it's not already, some of the decisions and designs that we're doing in the classroom, especially with regard to how we're building vocabulary and background knowledge. So that's why I started with this. But before we move on a little bit more into actual classroomy stuff, I do have a quick check-in that I wanted to do. Molly is going to throw up a poll in just a second, just to see how you're feeling so far about this information. And we'll leave it up for, I guess, what, a few seconds, a minute? No, time has no meaning anymore. COVID, thanks. Okay, awesome. So it sounds like vast majority of you are here with me and we're good to go. All right, thanks for checking in with me. I am learning a lot about how to manage my engagement strategies teaching in the time of COVID. So thank you for sharing that feedback with me. All right, let's talk a little bit more at the classroom level. Maybe, there we go. So just to sort of frame it one more time, intrinsic cognitive load increases when the content itself is kind of challenging, brand new, and inherently complex. Extraneous cognitive load increases when our students have to all of a sudden apply new knowledge that they're not that familiar with. So we're going to sort of look at how can we use vocabulary instruction to mitigate that extraneous cognitive load a little bit. So thinking about, rather than jumping right into an application hands-on type of activity, we need to build that background knowledge so that the students who are experiencing those difficulties with the new content for whatever reason are going to be able to get what we want them to get out of those kinds of activities. So here's yet another metaphorical image. I love these. We got a big dog and a little dog. And this is, I mean, no offense to big dogs or little dogs. I have big dogs, so I'm fine with all of them. But what I'm illustrating here, or attempting to illustrate here, is perspective. So you've got, in this picture, the big dog, the Great Dane, is your curriculum. It's full of shiny new content that you're excited about teaching, and you're excited for students to really work with and get their hands on and really start to dig in and become really good at, cell biology. But then your students, kind of, their perspective's a little different. They're looking at all of this new content and really just not sure what to make of it. Kind of like the little dog in this picture. I'm not sure of the breed, so I don't want to make assumptions. But the little smaller dog in this picture is sort of looking at the big dog with sort of, I'm not understanding what all of that is. As if you've ever watched interactions between little dogs and big dogs, it's pretty typical. So your student is experiencing difficulties learning all of this new content. And to them, it seems like this massively intimidating thing that they're just never going to be able to relate to. And that's where we come in. Okay, now this is going to look kind of random. I realize that. But this is an example of why teaching vocabulary explicitly and directly is super important. To us, well, not to us. If you are teaching this content, let's say, let's put it that way. If you are teaching cell division, which I am not an expert at, but if you are teaching cell division, this diagram makes a lot of sense. Like, this clearly illustrates, if you're an expert at this, how a cell divides through meiosis, right? And science teachers, just let it slide. If I'm saying something wrong, let it slide. Tell me later. I appreciate it. But if you look at the images, you can kind of see what's going on. But there's not much here that's connecting the images to the text. So here we've got all of these words that are pretty unfamiliar. Certainly a lot of intrinsic cognitive load happening here, because I don't know any of these words, right? I know some of them, but I don't know most of them. So there's a lot of the intrinsic cognitive load's pretty high. To the teacher's perspective, though, to the expert perspective, this is a pretty decent, graphical explanation of how cell division works. So this is an example of how sometimes we think the intrinsic cognitive load and the extrinsic cognitive or extraneous cognitive load are way down, but actually for the students who are brand new at this material, this is actually kind of a lot. So teaching some of these terms explicitly is going to alleviate some of the intrinsic cognitive load, because we're going to give students some background knowledge before we throw this kind of graphic at them. So that begs the question then, what words do I need to teach? I can't teach all of these words. Well, I'm going to put in the chat, when I have a second, I'm going to put a handout for you that has some resources that you can use to help you do that. But if you're feeling like, I don't even know how to begin choosing words to teach, and my textbook has a glossary and the words are bolded, like, they can figure it out, right? Not so much. As it turns out, one of the ways that we often think about teaching vocabulary in the English language arts world is through this kind of three-tier thing. Now, lots of things in education have 3 tiers. Response to intervention has 3 tiers. PBIS has tiers. So I realize that this is yet another thing that has 3 tiers, but stick with me. So the idea here, though, is that words are increasing in complexity and also decreasing in frequency the higher up the tiers they go. Let me rephrase that. Our common conversational words that we use all the time, that's our tier 1. Students know those words pretty well. They already use them pretty fluently in regular conversation and writing, and you don't have to teach those words, right? But then we have our tier 2 and our tier 3 words. Our tier 2 words are what we call academic words. And those are words that students will encounter frequently in school settings across subjects. So it's worthwhile to teach those. Kind of like for the tier 1 words, a lot of students figure those words out on their own, and they don't really need the explicit instruction on them. But some kids are going to need that. And frankly, all kids will benefit from it, because You're going to clear up a lot of misconceptions potentially. So examples of a tier 2 word, let's go with mathematics this time because I've been picking on science. So in math, average is would be a tier 2 word. Difference is another one. And those also illustrate the fact that a lot of academic words are multiple meaning words, which in and of itself is a good reason to explicitly teach those words and make sure that you're teaching what they mean for you in your content or in math, for example. So then we have our tier 3 words, which are words that we don't encounter that often, any of us, unless we are constantly working in that discipline or in that content. So if I can use our math example again, this would be things like cosine, trapezoid. You're not going to see that a lot in a common conversational way. You're really just going to see that in math class. So students aren't going to have the exposures to those words that they would normally have with words that are at like a tier 1, because those are words that they're going to see in the books that they read for pleasure. They'll see it they'll hear it in conversation on television, that sort of stuff. They're a lot less likely to have exposures to these other words, so they're not going to have the background knowledge. So all students, therefore, can benefit from explicit instruction of these words. We often hear about wanting students to use the language of the discipline and have discourse what's it called? Oh, geez, the math standards. I'm sorry, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, their standards have all of these, I think Common Core does too, has all of these areas where they are encouraging explanation, justification, argument, discussion, discourse around mathematical concepts, right? All of which is fantastic and absolutely is important and necessary. But we also have to realize that you have to be taught at some point the language of that discipline and the vocabulary of that discipline before you can really do those kinds of things. So what I'm talking about is making sure that we're giving these students these background knowledge elements to make sure that they're ready to do those things. So I keep mentioning explicit instruction, which if you have any background in special education, you are familiar with. So you can tune me out for a second. But explicit instruction is really not like an approach necessarily. It's really like a set of teacher behaviors. It's not really just one thing. It's a set of things that teachers can do. And it's real common to us in special education, but I wanted to take a minute to break it down just in case it's less familiar to some folks who are with us. When it comes to vocabulary instruction, explicit vocabulary instruction relies on sort of these elements of explicit instruction: logical sequence, clear models and explanations, and multiple opportunities for practice and feedback. Logical sequence simply means that you're teaching content, you're selectively teaching content from the simplest to the most complex. So you would need to teach average, for example, that word, before you start teaching, other statistics terms, right? You probably want to introduce average maybe before you start calling it a measure of central tendency, stuff like that. So you probably want to make a choice. And sometimes our curricula and our textbooks don't present it in the simplest to most complex way. So sometimes we have to make a choice to teach it in a slightly different order. Clear models and explanations is kind of, when people think about explicit instruction, they're usually thinking about the I do, we do, you do instructional sequence, which special education students know all too well from all of their lesson planning assignments. But really the idea is that you start by modeling and by giving super clear explanations of what it is you're going to have students do. And then you have a guided practice with that, where the students aren't quite on their own just yet. And then they do independent practice. So they have this supportive system before they're asked to really do it for themselves. Explicit instruction gets a little bit of a bad rap, I think, in general ed, because it can come across as repetitive and drill and kind of uninteresting, and where's the fun in that? And I hear you, I'm with you on that. But when you are first introducing a concept, a topic, it's a good thing to do to make sure that everybody's coming at it with the same information, right? So the other nice thing about explicit instruction is that it builds in these opportunities for practice and feedback in order to know that students understand the model that you're providing, you have to ask them, right? You have to find that out. So you have to give them opportunities to respond, and you have to give them lots of different modes of opportunities to respond to make sure that they're ready to move on to that we do step. And same thing again, when they're ready to move on from guided practice into independent practice. So having that kind of built in behind our vocabulary instruction is kind of what I'm getting at here. So why should you teach vocabulary like that when it does have such a bad rep for being repetitive and drilling and all of that? Well, like I've said from the beginning, we want to make sure that we are giving our students a solid background of content knowledge to make sure that other modes of instruction we want to use, like hands-on labs, inquiry-based learning, project-based learning, problem-based learning, all of the performance assessments, those kinds of things. We want to make sure that we're building a solid background in content knowledge for kids to be able to do those things successfully. If those are going to be successful learning experiences for students, we have to make sure that we've got them ready for it. In order for students to make the most of those other kinds of instruction, then we have to make sure that they have the background knowledge so that their intrinsic cognitive load is lessened just a little bit, because they're coming at it not from nothing, but with some background knowledge. The other thing I like to use to explain this is that we want to give students a chance to develop understanding before we ask them to deepen their understanding of conceptual things. A lot of times the reason we do labs and the reason we do problem-based learning and the reason we do all the other sort of application type activities is because it's going to give students a deeper understanding of the phenomenon that we're trying to study, or the topic that we're covering in math, or the concept that we're trying to cover. You can't deepen understanding that doesn't exist, is how I describe it to my students. So you have to make sure that you're developing that understanding to begin with. And so my argument here is that teaching vocabulary in an explicit instruction kind of way is an easy, not to mention successful, and evidence-based way to do that. So before we get into the actual strategies I want to share with you today, I want you to take a minute, and this isn't really a feedback type question, but I'm just repeating my visual cue here. In the chat, take a minute and think right now, if you were going to pick out 3 words that you want to teach in your content area, wherever you are right now in your curriculum, in your topic, or the next unit you're going to teach. I don't really need the context. I want to see 3 words that you would teach using an explicit instruction kind of approach, which I will show you. But go ahead and think of those 3 words and put those 3 words in the chat. I promise I'm not going to call anybody out. I just kind of want to see where you're thinking. Oh, I see my math teachers. I see you. Coefficient. I see you. I know I said I wasn't calling anybody out. I didn't call anybody out by name. So a version of this activity I do sometimes when in other settings is to have people try to guess the subject that you teach based on the vocabulary words you want to teach. I figured we probably wouldn't quite have time for that today, so I'm not including that, but I think it's interesting. At least on my end, it's kind of fun to try to guess what you guys teach based on the vocabulary that you're suggesting. I see a lot of math, so I'm glad that we're doing that. I'm glad we're using math examples. Absolutely, these are great. You guys are getting this. You have got this. Odds are the idea that there are common words you don't need to teach explicitly, and then there are words that you do need to teach explicitly, and then there's words that you only see in math class, for example. That's not a new concept. So I'm glad to see that you guys are already aware of that. Cool. Okay, so keep those 3 words in mind as we look at some of these strategies. And I'm not going to make you turn in your work. I'm not going to make you show your work. I'm not going to have you turn in anything. I just want to activate your thinking a little bit. So keep these words in mind as we go through the actual vocabulary instructional strategies and think about how could you do these with the words that you just named. Okay. So there's a lot really, but I'm going to focus on 4. And these are the 4 that in my experience, as well as in my research, have kind of proven to be the most effective for the most students. My area of expertise is in working with students with disabilities, especially reading disabilities, but these are things that are going to work for all students. And if you're going to teach vocabulary, these are what we just call good vocabulary teaching. So we're going to go through each of these. Hopefully some of them are familiar, but I will go ahead and say that if you get nothing else from this little seminar, providing student-friendly definitions is probably the most important, impactful thing you could start doing. The other ones are super important too, and also effective. But if you walk out of here with one thing stuck in your brain, provide student-friendly definitions is hopefully it. So let's start there. Providing student-friendly definitions. Now, sounds obvious, right? But I have lost count, to be totally honest with you, about how many classrooms I have gone in where the way that students are supposed to learn vocabulary is by reading the textbook chapter or by copying definitions out of the glossary, that sort of thing, which is not necessarily an evil, bad thing. It's not. I'm not here to do that. What it is not necessarily effective for all students. So what I'm providing is what I hope is an alternative to stuff like that. Because a student-friendly definition is clear and concise. So it is clear and it boils down to the most essential information that you need a kid to know about that word, not all the other words, just this word. And so it sort of focuses in on the essential information about a word, which is really what we should be doing anyway. When you are trying to develop a student-friendly definition, you want to keep it free from all the extra vocabulary. And I'll show you what I mean in a minute. And it may mean that you have to teach some extra vocabulary terms in order for all of that to come back together. Okay, it's still going to help students. I also am going to show you an example of using a visual cue that can help anchor the association for that student. I'll show you how that works in a second. I want to show you or talk about the image I have on the screen here, which is from a 8th grade science classroom that I observed and got permission to use this. This is a vocabulary lesson in an 8th grade science class. And in this case, I'm looking at this teacher's student-friendly definition, and I'm seeing that I would want students to also know mixture and substance before I give this as their student-friendly definition. So I can tell you though, because I was at this lesson to take this photograph, the word solution as a vocabulary word was being taught again in that logical sequence. So students had already had mixture as a vocabulary word and substance as a vocabulary word. So this is that logical sequence, simplest to most complex at work. So those words have been defined elsewhere. Otherwise, that's an example of like, get those words out of there. We need to simplify this a little bit. Okay, here's another example. Wait a minute, we've seen this before. Hang on a second, lady, what are you doing? So what I started with was a student-friendly definition, or let's say learner-friendly definition, because you guys are teachers. So let's say a learner audience-friendly definition of cognitive load theory. I gave you the most essential information first. I gave it to you in pretty clear conversational type words. I didn't get too academic with it. That's what makes it learner friendly or audience friendly, however we want to phrase that. So I gave you that to begin with. I also included a visual support and then repeated that visual support on multiple slides. Whenever I talked about cognitive load theory, I used the same image. So that's what I mean by an anchor image that can just help build those associations, connections, network of vocabulary learning. What we have learned about vocabulary learning in the brain, and I'm going to borrow a little bit here from Daniel Willingham, who is a professor at the University of Virginia. He's a cognitive psychologist, And I have a couple of his books recommended on the handout that I'm going to give you, because he has an excellent take on this. But the idea that we learn vocabulary through schema and through networks and connections, and not so much like a filing cabinet, can be very transformative to how we teach vocabulary. Understanding that the way that we incorporate new words into our working or our long-term memory is through connections to other words. And visual support has a lot to do with that. For most learners, I'm not perpetuating the learning styles myth at all, but it's a support, right? It's not a style, it's a support. That's why the anchor image is there. The other thing I did was I waited until I had provided the student-friendly definition before I told you all these other words. So I didn't use intrinsic, extraneous, or germane. I did not use those words in my student-friendly definition. I broke those down separately. So without you even knowing it, I modeled this very thing, student-friendly definition. You can leave me feedback and let me know whether or not you thought it was actually student-friendly, but that's what I was going for. So I wanted to highlight that. But let's talk about an actual classroom example and not just a professional development seminar. So here's a definition on the top left of your screen with the 3 bullet points of atom, right? This is from an actual science textbook, middle school science textbook, from their glossary. This is the definition of an atom in that glossary. Now, take a minute and look at that and think about how learner-friendly that is. There's a lot of words in there that are important to understanding the definition of atom the way that it's written here. What we want to do in coming up with a student-friendly definition is figure out a way to pull out things we should maybe teach separately, like picometers, and get down to just the gist of what we need students to know about what an atom is. Right away, we do not necessarily need them to know all of these things. Eventually, yes, we do need them to know all of those things. But initially, we don't. So we can give them that student-friendly definition that really boils down to the most essential information, which in this case, the teacher has brought down to the basic building block for all matter and has included a visual cue or an anchor image, same thing. At some point, that teacher is going to want to build off of that and talk about different types of matter and probably need to explain neutral and ionized atoms. But first we have to understand what an atom actually is before we start talking about whether they're neutral or ionized. And then at some other point we can define picometers. I'm not even sure what picometers are. You can also tell me that later. Anyway, so this is an example of taking the existing definition that's a little much and turning it into something that is actually student friendly and also provides room for you to build off of as the teacher, right? So you can scaffold off of this and then teach those other things like ionize and picometers and chemical element and all that good stuff. So you can build from there. The next strategy I wanted to talk about is using examples and non-examples, which again, probably not new to you. But what I want to highlight here is the importance of this being a very clear relationship to the vocabulary term that you're trying to teach. I think sometimes we feel pressured to use this because we think it's going to be helpful, but it turns out that the relationship isn't that clear. What matters is the relationship between the new term and the example that you're giving or the non-example that you're giving. It needs to be very clear to the students. Also, it needs to be not just clear to you, but clear to the students. You want to make that thinking that you have visible to them. You want to make sure that they see what that connection is and don't assume that they get it just because you threw it up on a slide. No offense. but making sure that they see the connection that you see and in the way that you see it. You also want to make sure that if you're going to use examples and non-examples, you need to model that first. This is where that explicit instruction sequence comes in, right? The I do, we do, you do. You want to make sure that you provide an example and a non-example when possible before you start asking them to come up with additional examples or non-examples. These can also have visual cues with them too, but it helps for the same reason it helps with definitions. You've probably seen this graphic organizer before. And what I want to point out is that this is actually a really helpful graphic organizer. There's a reason it's been around for decades. And that is because you can have students come up with their own example or non-example, and that's fine. But they should be able to build off of what you gave them as your model, right? So you made your thinking visible, you modeled for them what an example would be, and then they can build off of that. They have something to go by. So I'm in favor of this particular graphic organizer, as long as it's going to have a student-friendly definition on it, and it's going to have example, non-example based on what the teacher demonstrated. My third one here is teaching morphological parts. Now, I actually majored, believe it or not, in classical studies. So Latin and Greek mean a lot to me. They don't mean a lot to everybody else. So when they're there, you should teach morphological parts as a word learning strategy, as in something that students can generalize and use in other subjects as well. You want to make sure that if you're going to teach the parts, that the definition of those parts actually relates to the meaning of the word. And I'll show you what I mean. You also want to make sure that you rebuild the word. If you're going to take it apart, you have to rebuild it. Again, modeling for students. So let me show you how that works real quick. Let's say I want to teach the word photosynthesis, and I want to teach these word parts. Now, could I break this down even further? Yeah, I could. Do I need to get them to learn what photosynthesis is at a gist level? No, I do not. So photo has to do with light. You can give examples of that and non-examples of that as well. I'm not overcomplicating it here, but photo means light, and I have a visual cue for that as well. Synthesis, or to synthesize, means to make or put something together. Does it have a more complicated actual definition? Yes, but we want these to be student friendly also. And I also have a visual support there. So I'm emphasizing that the meaning of this part and the meaning of this part come together in our actual definition. Photosynthesis is the process that living plants use to turn light into energy for growth. Not only have I repeated the words that are in the word part definitions, but I've also shown how they work together. So remember, photo means light. So photosynthesis is when plants use light. What do they use it for? They use it to make energy. Oh yeah, synthesis. They use it to make energy. This is why putting the word back together is really important. If you're going to show kids how to break the word apart, you should also show them how to put it back together. And the last thing I wanted to mention is actually not so much an instructional strategy as it is just an instructional habit, I think, which is to make sure that you're using the vocabulary that you want students to know and you want them to use. I mentioned earlier about how Common Core standards, lots of other discipline-specific standards encourage students to be engaged in argument, justification, explaining, that kind of stuff. Well, we want them to do that, but we want them to do that with the language of that discipline, right? So we want to encourage their vocabulary use in discussion and in their writing. And they also need to see you do it. Again, modeling. They need to have a model of how this word gets used. I have an image here of a word wall, again, of which I am a big fan. But a word wall is only as effective as the connections that you help students make to it. So students need multiple exposures to lots of different words in seeing the word in lots of different ways, in conversation, in text, in a assignment, right? They need to have all those multiple exposures, and a word wall is a good way to do that. But if a teacher is just throwing words up on a word wall and not really discussing them with students and giving students a chance to really work with that word wall, then it's a little bit less effective. You also want to make sure that students get feedback from you when they misuse a vocabulary term, or when they don't use a vocabulary term when they should. For example, let's go back to math. If we're talking about parallel lines and a student talks about, when the lines are like next to each other, but they don't ever touch, you want to make sure that you reinforce that, okay, yeah, we call that parallel lines. Can you say that with me? Parallel lines. We want to make sure that we are giving corrective, supportive feedback for students when they use the wrong word or they use a description rather than the word itself, that kind of stuff. So we want to make sure that our use of vocabulary is modeling what we want students to be able to do. And so I'm going to leave it there and we'll start our Q&A in just a second. I'm excited about it. I just want to thank you again for being here today and for listening to me talk for 45 minutes without being a student in one of my classes. I appreciate it. I'm very happy to share materials, slides, to talk more in depth about any of these topics. I'm very, very happy to do that. Like I said, I love working with in-service teachers. That's kind of why I got into this gig. So I kind of look forward to doing that. So I'm very open to those kinds of connections with you guys. Here's my contact information and also an older photo, but one I like better than the one on the ISU website. So it's not a great photo, but it's better than the old one. So please feel free to reach out to me. I love obviously talking about this stuff, and I love working with teachers on their practice for anything that's going to help students access text and content knowledge a little bit easier. I'm here for that. So thank you for being here, and I'm excited about this Q&A. Deborah?
Hey, thanks a lot, Dr. Peoples. Wow, I really appreciated how you talked about we have to develop understanding before we deepen understanding. As a general education teacher, you have me thinking about how many times I have engaged students in trying to deepen their understanding of something before I really developed that understanding. So that is something that will stay with me beyond this webinar today. So I appreciate that. We are
honestly, like I have to remind myself of it working with my pre-service teachers. One of my former, by the way, pre-service teacher students is with us today, so I keep calling him out, but he'll speak to that, I'm sure. That I have to remind myself to not have them applying things before I've made sure that they have the background knowledge I actually thought they had. Before I ask them to like write a lesson plan on vocabulary, we need to talk about the vocabulary instruction itself first. So yeah, I have to remind myself of that all the time too.
Yeah, because I really appreciate like inquiry practices and project-based practices, but then when you said that, I thought, oh wow, yeah, you have to take something to those kinds of engagements, to deepen that knowledge.
Right.
So here we have a question for you. What are your thoughts about focusing on teaching word bases? So common version of Latin, Greek roots.
I'm a big fan of it. I used to do it. I can't remember, God, I cannot remember the name of the curriculum because it was ages ago, but it was it was basically like taking Latin, was this whole curriculum for middle school students to learn about word building through Latin and Greek word roots. I cannot remember the name of the curriculum, but I remember having to argue with my principal about buying it. I'm a big fan of that. I think that you can teach a useful set of prefixes, base words that students can generalize and transfer across lots of different areas. It's going to help them break down unfamiliar words in other situations. And I think as long as that's the focus of that kind of instruction, that this is a strategy, it's a word learning strategy, then I'm all for it. I think it can be very effective. I've seen it be very effective in my own practice.
So to build on that a little bit, what grade level would you start that at?
Oh man, I've seen it in like second and third grade. I did not teach second or third grade, but I have seen second or third grade classes that do that a little bit, especially with the number prefixes, like mono, uni, bi, di, tri, all of the, like, I've seen a lot of those in like elementary math. Let's see, with the actual like base word type stuff, I think I taught middle school, so the earliest I ever taught it was sixth grade. And I remember having students who were like, oh yeah, I had a teacher mention this to me. I know like some other teacher had mentioned it, but it hadn't really stuck. So that's an interesting question about how young. I think it depends on what you're going to do with it so that students can see what to generalize it to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I work with some second and third graders in the Borg Center. So I've done some more Anglo-Saxon kind of prefixes and suffixes, and but I haven't as much dipped into Latin and Greek roots, but
It can be a lot, like it can be a lot. And that's saying something for like I'm familiar with those things and I'm still like, eh. The other thing is just because it's Latin and Greek doesn't mean that the meaning is the same. So that's why I tried to emphasize that is that if you're going to teach those word parts, then you want to make sure that the definition of the word part matches the definition of the word you're trying to teach, if that makes sense. Not to get all meta about it, but yeah. So if the word root itself doesn't really have a strong connection to the definition of that word, then maybe don't teach morphological parts for that word. Stick with your student-friendly definition and your examples, and that's plenty.
Awesome. So Andrew Kelly thinks you're the best teacher
Oh,
ever.
Andrew's the best.
And here's another question. What tips would you have for teachers who teach vocabulary in their language arts class? I feel like we cover so many words without effective retention for students.
Yes, yes. Whew, yes. So it can be really daunting, especially in those middle grades and secondary grades, to try to cover all of the possible vocabulary words. I like trying to sort of pre-assess a little bit and see what words do students already know and how well do they know them. There is some research behind the idea that we know words at different levels. So a word that I know and can use pretty fluently in writing, speaking, listening, reading, those are words that I know at one level, but then there are words that I don't know at all. Just because I just don't know them as well. So there's some research behind that. And I think pre-assessing can help you figure out how much of that you actually have to explicitly teach. And I think as an instructional sequence, I think it makes sense to pre-teach vocabulary once you know what you need to teach and then keep coming back to it. It helps that retention. The more exposures, like I said, students have to those words, that boosts retention and gets those things in the long-term memory. Yeah, I don't know if that's the answer that person was looking for, but I don't have a great answer for that. Like it's hard. It's hard.
So let's see if we can build on that a little bit. So like, is it better to teach less words with more repetition and continued work, or more work? It's almost some sort of balancing act, right?
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes it hard. I feel like in my experience and based on the research that I've seen, I think that teaching fewer words with more depth, I think is probably more impactful than like a 20-word vocabulary list that you have a quiz on in 2 weeks. I think probably less is more, if that makes sense. Which is hard because then you're like, well, okay, but they don't know these other words either. So it is kind of a sticky situation to try to pick all those.
Yeah.
words.
So now I'm trying to think of that in relation to cognitive load theory. Like if I overload them with too many words, is there something? Yeah.
Exactly. And the other thing that can drive that cognitive load down a little bit is the clarity with which you're teaching those fewer words. So if you feel like there's a lot of words, but I feel like I can do a pretty good job of doing a clear student-friendly definition for all of them, then do all of them. That's fine. Otherwise, I think maybe less is more and find other opportunities to bring in those other words. Yeah, that's hard because you don't want to feel like you're choosing not to teach something. Like that's a hard thing for teachers to think about.
Yeah, so I have another question related to the developing student-friendly definitions. One of the things when you were talking about tier 2 words, you said many of those words have multiple definitions, right? They have multiple meanings. So do you not deal with multiple meanings at all in that first friendly definition?
No, I think you want to provide your student-friendly definition first for what you're teaching. So if you're teaching difference, in math, you want to make sure that you teach the math definition for difference. But you also want to address the possible misconceptions that students might have about, yeah, well, we use the word difference in lots of other ways. What are some of those other ways? Well, here's what it means in math. So when we're talking about difference in math, and when we're using that word, we want to make sure that we're using it, in the math definition. So you want to just be really explicit about, yes, there are multiple meanings, but this is the one we're using right now. And that's easier with little kids than it is with older kids. Um, but the thing about them having multiple meanings is that that's also what makes them generalizable across content, right? So like if you become familiar with the word average through 6th grade math, you're just as likely to come across that word with a different connotation in a book you read for language arts or a story that you read for language arts. And you can, again, like you may not know the exact definition that is being used in the story. You remember the math definition though, but that's still something, right? So you still have some background knowledge on that word, and you can maybe apply what you learned about that word in math. Maybe it works here. And so you're still lessening that cognitive load a little bit by giving students some background knowledge to go on.
That's great. Thank you. So we have a new question up from Stephanie. Can words be grouped by meaning or spelling?
Ooh, I think that depends on if you're teaching vocabulary, yeah. When you're teaching spelling, that's more of a word family decoding thing. I think when you're teaching vocabulary, yes, you can teach by meaning. But I think I would want, in order to help build like the connections among words, like to help strengthen that, network of schema and all that, to make sure that words are sort of, not make sure, but if you're teaching words in a content area, that they're all from the same sort of topic. So they may not share meaning necessarily, but they share a topic, and that can help build those connections as well. I don't know if that, I feel like that's not that person's question, but if that teacher would like to clarify that question, I will try to clarify my answer.
I would like to try to help, because I think of vocabulary and spelling as addressing different components of literacy.
Yeah.
Right? Vocabulary is more addressing meaning and comprehension, where spelling is addressing more phonics or, the code. So do you recommend learning how to spell vocabulary words, or do you think just let's focus on the meaning of those and deal with spelling words, at a separate time? Or
I think it depends on the audience, for lack of a better word. I think with older students, they're more likely to be producing stuff with word processing and spell check anyway. So the spelling is a little less important. Not that it's not important, but I think that I don't think I would emphasize the spelling, if that makes sense. I think I would correct it if I see it misspelled, but I don't think I would like do a lot of practice with spelling. If I'm trying to get them to learn vocabulary for comprehension, I feel like my recommendation, and again, there are other people in the reading teaching club who would probably kick me out for this, but I think spelling is useful, but it's not always going to help with comprehension. And so if that's your end goal, then you want to stick with meaning over spelling as an emphasis, I guess.
Okay, so Stephanie's clarifying for us.
Okay.
She was relating that to the question about so many words to cover. Not so much spelling, but word parts that are similar between words.
Yes. Yes. If you find like a really common word root, I'm trying to think of a good one. If you think of a really common word root, like ROTA, rota, which means to turn. It's a Latin root, and it means to turn. So teaching word families kind of in that way, like these are all the words that have that root and that have to do with that meaning. Rotate. Now I can't think of any other words.
Rotation. Rotary. Rotary?
Rotary, yes. Rotary. That's why they're symbols of wheel. Somebody in their little activity that we did mentioned rotation as a rotation, axis. I forget where your third word was on that one, but that was going to be one of the words you were going to teach. you could teach that word root and then also demonstrate, like, look, here are all these other words that have that word root. They all have similar meanings to rotation. So, and again, like, you want to emphasize the strategy of that and not the memorization of that. Like, some kids are going to do well with memorization, but almost all kids are going to do well with learning a strategy over learning memorization.
Awesome. And thank you, Stephanie, for that clarification. It is 5 o'clock. I mean, time just flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? So thank you, Dr. Peoples, for being with us here with us today. And thank you, participants, for joining us. We know your time is valuable, and we're honored that you chose to spend this hour with us.
Especially on a Thursday afternoon. My God, I'm so impressed that you all showed up. Yeah.
Within a week?
This is going to be my new argument. This is going to be my new argument in 9:30 a.m. class, that I'm going to tell them, like, listen, these teachers can show up to hear me talk at 4 p.m. on a Thursday. You can show up at 9:30 on a Monday.
That's right.
But please, folks, email me, let me know if you have other questions we didn't get to, because I love talking about this stuff.
Great. Within a week, you will find the recording of this webinar on the Redbird Educator Series website where you registered. We are interested in your feedback about this session. So tomorrow you'll receive a follow-up email that will include a link to a short survey. If you're interested in receiving the professional development hour for your attendance today, you will find a link to the evidence of completion form at the end of the survey. We will host one more webinar this spring on Wednesday, April 21st at 4 p.m. You can join us for Towards Engaging and Relevant Disciplinary Literacy, featuring Dr. Erin Quast from the School of Teaching and Learning. Again, thank you for spending some time with us today. Take care, and we hope to see you in April.